When compersion is fetishized, it turns more into a selfish want, and it's dangerous because then people might pressure each other.
So when being in a non-monogamous relationship, is compersion necessary?
This aspiration that generosity and compersion should only be this completely selfless or almost self-sacrificial action is flawed. Can you convince them to go out and sleep with more people? Because, hey, I want that compersion.
My name is Abby, and I'm the voice behind the Evolving Love Project. In this podcast, my husband and I deep dive into the topics of non-monogamy and polyamory, drawing from our experiences of being consensually non-monogamous for almost a decade.
My name is Liam. Whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, curious, or anything in between, we invite you to join us for this conversation.
Let's begin.
Welcome to the Evolving Love Podcast. Today we have Dr. Marie Thouin joining us once again on the podcast to celebrate the release of her groundbreaking new book, What is Compersion? Dr. Marie Thouin is a leading expert and scholar on compersion in consensual non-monogamy. She has authored 2 pioneering research studies, the first ever encyclopedia entry on compersion, and has recently authored the first ever scholarly book on compersion.
Jessica Fern, author of Polysecure and Polywise, and a previous guest on the Evolving Love podcast, wrote the foreword to What is Compersion? This is what Jessica had to say to finish off the foreword. Welcome to a groundbreaking exploration of compersion. May this book not only inform, but also inspire you to approach relationships with a renewed sense of possibility, understanding, and most importantly, a heart open to the myriad of ways we can love and support each other's happiness.
Marie is also the founder of Love Insight, a mindful dating and relationship coaching practice where she supports people of all ages, genders, and sexual relationship orientations to create vibrant and intentional love lives, including folks navigating non-monogamy and non-traditional relationship structures. Whether you are new to the concept of compersion or well-versed, this conversation has something for everyone and raises lots of interesting questions and food for thought along the way.
In this episode, we discuss what is compersion, perceived and real fears. Do we really need compersion? Is compersion selfish? Reciprocal altruism and kinship altruism. Whether you can learn compersion. And Liam even proposes a new scientific study that involves refractory periods and compersive behaviours. Liam and I unpack our own relationship to compersion and so much more. So now we bring to you Dr. Marie Thouin. Marie, so exciting to have you back on the podcast. Welcome.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me back.
Well, it's so wonderful to be able to have another chat with you, especially because you're about to release your new book, What is Compersion? And I thought that might be the best place for us to start, actually. So just with a definition of compersion.
About a year ago, me and a colleague named Dr. Sharon Flicker, we published a 3-part definition in the Encyclopedia of Sexual Behavior and Psychology. And that's the definition that I used in my book, because compersion is not just one thing. I think we all hear about the kind of general definition as, I feel happy when you're happy, I'm sharing your joy. But really, when I ask people in my research, what is compersion? There's really a broad variety of definitions that emerged. And I think it's super important to start there. So, number 1, compersion is a broad range of positive emotions that one would feel in relation to their partner's other relationships. So that's the more, general poly understanding of compersion. I feel happy for you when you're having a great romantic time with someone else. The second one, though, that was probably the most surprising and maybe practically helpful aspect of my research was it's the broad range of thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors that one might experience in relation to their partner's other relationships. And that means that compersion is not only an emotion, it's also something that you can think and act and have an orientation towards. So I think that's important because it means you can be compersive without always feeling this very happy, empathic joy. And then the third definition is compersion in general situations outside of non-monogamy. It's the broad range of positive emotions, attitudes, thoughts, and behaviors that one would experience in relation to someone's success and good feelings in any aspects of their life. And I think that's important also because some people are using the word compersion outside of non-monogamy, and I think that's a really great addition to the English language that doesn't really have vocabulary for that.
And in terms of when you were researching this book, I know this book is based on your PhD thesis. So can you talk through just a little bit about how you collected this data and how you collected these stories that informed how you wrote the book?
My research method was called grounded theory, and that is qualitative research. So instead of giving a survey to a lot of people, I did interviews with a smaller pool of people, like in my case, about 22 people who are non-monogamous and have experienced compersion. And I sat down with each one of them and I interviewed them for about an hour or 90 minutes. And I asked them questions such as, what is compersion to you? How do you experience it? When do you experience it? In what contexts? In what contexts do you struggle to experience it, or do you not experience it? In what context do your partners experience it? How do you think it's connected to social change? How do you think it's connected to other aspects of your life? And from all of this data, I distilled it into themes that answered basically two research questions. The first one was, what is compersion? So really coming up with a definition that portrays what people are experiencing and people are describing out there. And the second question was, what are the factors that promote or hinder compersion? And that was important to me because there is pre-existing research that say that compersion is correlated with relationship satisfaction in non-monogamy. So if we know what it takes to promote it and what are the things that hinder it, then we have a little bit more power and agency and knowledge to know what we might want to do if we want more of it. And we can also understand and have compassion for the situations where we might struggle to experience it or where our partners struggle to experience it.
What did you find were some of the main promoters of compersion? What was coming up for people when they were experiencing more compersion?
So the factors were split into three categories. One was individual, the other one was relational, and the third one was social. And within the individual factors, there's two. One is the commitment to ideological values of non-monogamy. And that means being in alignment, in integrity, in self-consent with being in a non-monogamous relationship versus being in a non-monogamous relationship out of maybe pressure or duress. I don't know if folks have heard the expression poly under duress or PUD.
Yes.
But that would be the opposite. So if you're in a relationship that is non-monogamous out of your alignment with the value system of it, then you have a better chance of experiencing compersion. Number two is inner security. And that means self-esteem, self-worth, self-confidence, and also being resourced. So people told me oftentimes that if they felt really good about themselves that day, or they've had a great night of sleep, they've eaten well, they will be a lot more likely to experience compersion rather than when they might, feel really crappy or sleep deprived or exhausted, or they just had a really bad situation at work. So that sense of how am I feeling about myself in this moment has a large impact.
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. You have to have that sense of happiness within yourself so that you can then, have that for the people around you and your relationships.
Exactly. And that leads us to the relational factors, where the first one is feeling secure in your relationship. And that speaks to a sense of abundance also at the relational level. Like when you feel like there's an abundance and almost like a saturation or a satiation of love and affection and resources in your existing relationship, it's going to be a lot easier to feel generous and feel like you can have compersion for other relationships versus feeling like your relationship is going through a tumultuous period, or it's under rocks, or there's a deprivation of love and a scarcity of love. There's also, very importantly, your connection with your metamours. And people don't need to be best friends with their metamours necessarily, but having respect and a good rapport, or at least a good sense, like trust towards the metamours, that was actually probably like the most impactful factor of all. And I'm saying that according to like other research project that's been done after mine, where they said that this was the most impactful factor in terms of compersion.
Well, it makes sense in terms of if you feel a sense of threat, if you feel that maybe potentially a metamour is coming in and destabilizing your relationship, that you're, venturing out from, it does make sense that, it's so difficult to feel that sense of compersion. It's just almost completely overridden by jealousy. And as you write in the book, you do talk about jealousy and compersion often kind of commingling, and existing together. But if there is that sense of threat, it would be extremely hard to cultivate any sense of kind of real compersion.
There's kind of like the dials, like of compersion that I explain, and like my theory of compersion. And one is, are you making positive meaning out of this situation? The more you do, the more likely you are to experience compersion. And then there's the sense of threat on the other hand, which is, of course, the more threat you experience, the less likely you are to have compersion. And so it's kind of like the combination of those two is going to be the context from which compersion arises. And every context is completely different.
And also changing as well, because the sense of threat can be real or perceived, I'd imagine, because one can feel threatened by a situation that potentially isn't actually threatening, through a multitude of factors. But if there is a situation that is genuinely threatening, like if you feel that someone is genuinely trying to come in and rob me from the nest, it is a very different situation.
This is something that we've spoken about a lot, because sometimes I have a fear, but it's like a perceived fear. It's not actually. It's not a real fear. So
I'm not going anywhere. I'm very happy. Things are great.
So the next factor actually to that, in the relational category, is the perception of benefits from your partner's other relationships. And that will also impact whether or not someone experiences compersion. And the kind of benefits that people might notice is, well, they might feel less pressured to fulfill all of their partner's needs. They might feel less guilt if they are having other relationships with other folks. They might feel like they have a richer social life, a richer emotional life, a richer sexual life. They might feel like they're able to express themselves more authentically. They might feel like they're growing, their partners are growing, and they're reaping the benefits of that. So the more benefits that are perceived in a non-monogamous situation, the more likely you are to experience compersion. And conversely, if you feel like a metamour or another relationship is taking away rather than adding to the relational ecosystem, then less compersion is possible. And then the last factor that I want to mention is the social factor. And that is something that's not talked about very much in existing research, but it's, are you surrounded by supportive community? Are you able to talk to folks who are also non-monogamous, or at least supportive in that, where when you might experience struggles, you have other folks to turn to who are not going to say like, oh, of course you're experiencing trouble because you're not monogamous.
Yes. What do you expect?
Exactly. And having role models and media like podcasts like yours, or literature that is supportive of that very different paradigm, is going to support compersion, because we learn by example. We learn as humans by other people modeling certain behaviors, certain attitudes, certain emotions. And the more we see them modeled, the more we're likely to experience them.
So when being in a non-monogamous relationship, is compersion necessary? We really need it?
Well, that is a good question, and I hear it a lot.
It's a hot topic.
And that leads me to the distinction between attitudinal compersion and embodied/emotional compersion. So as I said in the beginning, like there's different kinds of compersion, and I talk about that in my book as well. And my answer to your question is that the embodied or emotional kind of compersion is really not necessary. I think it's a bonus. I think it's an extra, and it's really fun when it happens. But what's more fundamental to relationship harmony is that attitudinal compersion, which basically means I support my partner's other relationships. I see them as a positive event. I don't see them as a threat. And I'm overall not going to sabotage them. I'm going to be in support, even if I'm not feeling thrilled about it emotionally. Does that resonate with your experience?
It does. There's something so, beautiful about that, where it's like, it's not inherently sort of self-serving in that way. It's like, I'm happy for you, and this isn't, it's not necessarily about me, but I'm happy for you, and I want to support you with that. And I feel like that doesn't always get the cred that this embodied compersion gets. I feel like there can be a lot of like, wow, they're so turned on, or they're so like having this, a partner's having such a thrill from, me dating. But there's something so stable and beautiful about, really supporting a partner when it's not, that big embodied experience, which brings me back to, does erotic compersion count as compersion, Marie? I'm really interested to know about this.
Also a really good question. And I have a whole section in my book about this.
Yes.
Sometimes, as a relationship coach, I have people coming to me who might feel that their partner is not dating enough or not sleeping with enough people because they want to witness their partner sleeping with other people because that turns them on. And they're like, hey, I'm the most compersive person in the universe because that turns me on. And can you convince them to go out and sleep with more people? Because, hey, I want that compersion.
But that's like a fetish.
Yes, exactly. I think sometimes when compersion is fetishized, it turns more into a selfish want. And it's dangerous because then people might pressure each other into doing things that they don't necessarily want. And that's almost the kind of like the opposite of compersion. Compersion is more of this like, well, I want you to do what you want, and I'm going to be on board with that. That said, I mean, who are we to say like, well, that shouldn't apply? Or, like no one has ownership on the word. And I think there's such a fine line. I researched the topic of hot wifing or even cuckolding and how it might relate or connect or reflect compersion. And if I look at research in that field, some quotes are very much reflecting like a selfish interest in, somebody's own pleasure, even if their partner is not enjoying themselves very much. And then some participant quotes actually really do reflect compersion. Like there's people who identify as cuckolds and they just really get a thrill when their partner is having a great time, and they feel like that is really necessary to center their partner's pleasure in order for them to have a good time and get off. And everyone really has to be on board full-heartedly. So that is a really interesting conversation and distinction about like what is selfish or what is selfless.
Very nuanced and very individual and like very, very case by case. There wouldn't be a blanket, this is selfish and this is selfless. It's like very much dependent on the relationship.
Because in the book you talk about the two types of altruism, reciprocal altruism and then also kin altruism, and how that correlates with kind of this notion of selfishness, compersion, and that interaction. Can you talk a bit about those two types of altruistic behaviors?
Yeah, in evolutionary psychology, the folks who researched that field have coined reciprocal altruism to designate like this tit for tat strategy, such as you're going to do something for me and I'm going to do something for you in exchange, versus kin altruism is when you just kind of do something for other people because they're part of your kin. Like you just feel really inspired to do something without the promise of an immediate reciprocity or reward. But in both cases, there's empathy involved. Or at least in the kin altruism notion. Like if I'm inspired to do something good for someone else, I also want to feel like I'm sharing their joy. And I want to share their pain and relieve their pain. And there's something really special about empathic ability as humans that, like, it drives us to want other to feel good, and it makes us feel good. So is it ever completely selfless? That is also debatable. Like there's always in a way like a reward for us in seeing someone happy and making someone happy and doing something good for somebody else. So I think it can sometimes be a bit of a false dichotomy. And this aspiration that generosity and compersion should only be this completely selfless or almost self-sacrificial action is flawed, because the idea is like more for you should feel like more for me. And in practice, gratitude is a very big part of compersion, and feeling like there are benefits received to the relational ecosystem, to the almost like the kin, is important in feeling like there's compersion. Versus if you feel like maybe your partner is actually not being treated well by a metamorph, by someone else, and their resources are getting depleted, and it's not necessarily this like egoic jealousy coming up, but it's just not a good situation. I work with a lot of people like that too. It's going to be hard and maybe even inappropriate to feel compersion if you feel like your partner is in an abusive relationship or something like that.
There's also the sense that compersion has to look one way all the time. Like often when we talk to people about compersion in our conversation nights, there is kind of a narrow definition. I feel often with my sense of compersion, sometimes it does kind of oscillate between an embodied compersion and an attitudinal compersion. And sometimes it's more of one and less of the other. And it's also so dependent on the different partners that Abby has. Some partners, there is more of a real sense of like, real attitudinal compersion. Others, it is that embodied compersion where it's like super lustful and there's that kind of erotic element to it. So it's fascinating when you kind of look into your own relationship with compersion and start to analyze, where it's coming from.
Well, I would love to hear a little bit more about your experience in that realm. Like, do you think compersion is selfish or selfless, or how so?
Well, it's really an interesting one. And I mean, well, first of all, when you say Abby's partners, I feel like you make it sound like I have so many partners, right now, all at once.
An army of lovers.
We really sort of mean, over the course of 10 years of our relationship, having different partners at different times. Yeah, it's so fascinating because, there are times I feel like where Liam, your compersion is coming from that erotic, it's that sexual place, and that is very strong for you, and it always has been, but you've always been so gentle and aware that it can be a little bit in that fetish space. So just when we're coming back to like who is this for and what is this about, that it is a genuine and authentic opportunity for me to connect with somebody. And if there is the benefit of that pleasure for Liam, then that is like a wonderful addition, as you've said. But it has been really interesting, as we have sort of evolved, over the years and moved away or not moved away, but expanded more into polyamorous connections, having to go sort of more into that, that like intellectual experience of compersion or on a values level of compersion. And, knowing that, an experience for me that isn't necessarily a sexual experience, but is so enriching for me, like a non-sexual date, and really feeling that compersion and that happiness as well. So I think the compersion has been, it's such a journey for the two of us. And I'm similar in that my compersion changes and shifts. We've spoken about it before, Marie, with my hormones. If I'm premenstrual, compersion is way down. And when I'm not feeling hormonal in that way, the compersion is up. So that makes for a really interesting navigation space too. And I am similar to Liam in that I do have a high level of sexual compersion, but when, the connection is more, like relationship forming or emotional, sort of more polyamorous, there's so much more sort of work that I have to do. And I'm up for doing that. And I say to Liam, I'm like, this is the stuff that needs to be cheered on, because for me, the sexual compersion comes way, that's with ease for me. So, it's just fascinating. Yeah. I'll also say that from the other perspective of witnessing Liam's compersion for a new partner of mine, it actually really makes me feel so much more secure in that new relationship as well. And so it sort of like becomes this beautiful feedback loop, I guess, where I feel like, more into my new partner and then more into the connection with Liam and then witnessing that meta-more connection. Just honestly, it can just leave me like lost for words, witnessing a beautiful new meta-more friendship connecting. So it's beautiful.
I will add one thing to that,
yes,
because that's beautifully said, Abby. The notion of kind of selfish and like the selflessness of compersion. I feel like there's almost a compersion in allowing your partner to be a bit selfish as well, potentially. Like maybe there is like allowing your partner the space to kind of be selfish in their desires, and then allowing that to flourish. I think that there might be something for that. If it's not a destructive, if it's not something that's being destructive to a relationship or any other things in the constellation of the non-monogamy. But what do you think about that, Marie? Is there anything in that?
I love that. I love how you phrase that. Yes, allowing your partner to be a little bit selfish and to have their pleasure. And like there's no like rigid lines, I think, in terms of what should qualify as compersion and what shouldn't qualify as compersion. Again, no one has the ownership over that concept. And it is a very fluid and dynamic word. And one thing that will encapsulate it for me is being on the same team. Feeling like, we're not stuck in rigid roles and we are on the same team. We both want other people to be, or the other person in our relationship to be fully expressed and thrive. And we both want to be really feeling alive. And that doesn't look the same way every time.
If you're enjoying this conversation, we invite you to show your support for Evolving Love by sharing this episode with someone that you think may enjoy it. Whether it is a lover, family member, or a friend, sharing this episode is a fantastic way to support the work we do here.
For those who would like exclusive access to 2 extra full podcast episodes a month and unlock my full exclusive writing archive, you can become a premium member at evolvingloveproject.substack.com.
We are an independent podcast and your support means the world to us. Because there is that interaction between compersion, like even when you talk about that, it kind of seems, I reflect on it because we are a couple, and we have a hierarchical relationship in which we're both primary partners. But I wonder how that compersion kind of tracks if you do have a more anarchist style. Can we look at it through the same lens if you're in a solo, poly, anarchist kind of framework of relational referencing?
Yes, I talk about it a little bit in my book. I didn't do formal research to compare, compersion and hierarchical relationships versus solo poly versus open relationships or swinging. But it depends on how people feel that there is or isn't an abundance of love and resources and that they're in the role that they want to be in. So, for example, someone who is a solo poly person, for example, and dating someone who is in an established couple, some people have experienced feeling dehumanized or dismissed or that their needs were less important because they felt that there was couple privilege at play. But then other people confided in me and said, oh my gosh, I am so supportive of these people's relationship because they treat me really well. I'm not trying to be anybody's primary partner. I'm not competing for the same spot. And there is love and respect all around. So it's really hard to just say like, oh yes, like it's easier to have compersion in one style or another. I think it depends again on a constellation of factors and just like how people are treated and how people feel about their needs and are their specific needs, their variable needs being met.
With other partners as well, you know, connecting in with their relationships, because sometimes I can actually feel a little bit more jealous or a little bit envious of another partner of mine, of their other connections. And I think it's, you know, perhaps it's because, we're not in that sort of established relationship or anything, in the way that Liam and I are. We have a lot of security. We've been together for 12 years. We've been together for 12 years. And one of the things that I find really helps me is actually, really hearing about their other relationships and their other connecting. And if they're going on a first date, just like not pretending that that's not happening. I sometimes feel like that there can still be some like normative things that come up where people sort of hide their other partners, and it just comes back to that getting to know metamors as well, and discussing it straight out the gate.
Because you also feel compersion for your partners and their partners, I think, as well. But there is a more real sense of kind of threat to the relationship that you have if you're not in a primary relationship with someone else. Like that moves away from a perceived threat to a very real threat of that, connection not continuing as it always has.
Well, that's right. And I think, having been exploring non-monogamy for 10 years and I guess separate dating since 2016, I think there is a lot of talk around, couples, vetoing a new partner or this and that. But there's also the reality that a new partner of somebody who I'm seeing will decide that they don't want them to see me anymore. And that has happened to me, on many sort of occasions. So that's when people say, why do your connections often end? And I say, because their monogamous partner came along, or they met somebody else and she wasn't comfortable with me. And it's a fascinating space.
And I wonder, Marie, in terms of when you work with clients that, when you're coaching and when you're discussing these topics with clients, how do you bring up a way for people to figure out whether they actually are compersive? Is there like I don't know if there's like a test or if there's like a check-in system. It's like almost like a multi-amory radar, but for compersion. Is there something that exists like that you do with couples or people that you work with?
Actually, I did develop a worksheet where people can assess themselves on different factors. So all the factors I named earlier that promote and hinder compersion, I developed like an almost 50-item questionnaire where people can rate themselves on all of these factors in detail and see what are the bottlenecks. What are the things that kind of in the system, whether it's their connection with the metamor, whether it's their social environment, their communities, whether it's something in terms of their security within themselves or their mindset. Like, where are the places in that kind of compersion roadmap? Where are they feeling really strong and on board and resourced versus where are they not? Where are they not feeling as secure? And that is so helpful for the coaching process, because then we know what are the places where we can focus that's going to create the most change. Like I don't have a cookie cutter coaching format because everyone is in a very different context. And if we can just pinpoint what parts of the context can use the most improvement and love and attention, then we create change very quickly.
Have you come across people who've moved from a state where they felt a complete inability to access compersive feelings to then being this like liberated, compersive person moving through the world in this glorious way?
Well, actually, in my book, I have a chapter that's titled A Spectrum of Compersion. So it's to kind of dismantle this myth that you either are compersive or you're not.
Yes.
And people are always somewhere on the spectrum, right? From very, very intense jealousy to benevolent neutrality to attitudinal compersion to embodied compersion. And I don't say that there's one place that's just always better to be at. It's normal. It's like, in life, we're not always happy, happy, happy. Sometimes we're sad. Sometimes we're angry. Sometimes we're jealous. And it's all good. Like, we can't expect to just remove all the negative or the difficult emotions from life without removing the aliveness of life. And it's normal to always be at a different spot on that spectrum. So I want to normalize that before I answer your question directly. That said, yeah, there are people who kind of need just a little tweak, and you can see change very quickly. For example, I had a client who came to me and he was just freaking out because him and his wife had been in a monogamous marriage for about 15 years, and all of a sudden she met someone else that she wanted to date, and he had no context for non-monogamy, and he was understandably very afraid. And one of the first things we talked about was for him to join an online community and talk to people about their experiences of non-monogamy. And he did that, immediately made some close friends within that community, and very quickly had a support system to handle all that, and realized that actually he was open to the idea of being non-monogamous and started doing his own exploration. And within the realm of a few weeks, everything changed. Everything changed for him in terms of, there was still fear, there was still threat and challenges, but at least he felt like he was on board and he had support. So sometimes it doesn't take that much. But then, of course, it depends what the bottlenecks are. If it's deep wounding, deep trauma, deep abandonment issue, or big problems in the existing relationship that are being uncovered because of non-monogamy, then it's going to take probably more work to detangle all that. And that work is very important and very good to do, but everyone is different.
Yeah, and non-monogamy definitely puts the magnifying glass on whatever is going on, the good, the bad, the things that are happening within the self. But yeah, gosh, I really relate to that. Having community and being in these conversations about compersion and non-monogamy. Actually, just reflecting on the last podcast that we did with you, Marie, I was having such a difficult time that week with my compersion and feelings of jealousy that were coming up for me. It was really, really actually a tough week for Liam and I, because I was trying to support him but was also just really going through it within myself. But after we had the podcast with you, it was just crazy. I had all of these feelings of compersion. I felt really clear. I felt really validated. I felt really secure. And that was just after talking with you and just talking about compersion and just getting into it. And I feel like the more that I read about compersion, or the more that I'm discussing it, the more that I'm in those circles in this community, my compersion goes up. So community is just huge, being able to openly discuss all of these things.
I think you just need to talk to Marie all the time, every day. It should be a daily check-in.
I mean, poor Liam had whiplash last time because we'd had such a difficult night the night before, and then we got up early and had the podcast with you, and I was like, oh, you should go and
go on that date
date and, I'm fine. And Liam was just like, who are you?
I was like, I can't deal with this roller coaster, Marie. I was like, this is a lot. But it does make me, like, talking about all this stuff does make me think, and maybe I'd like to propose a test for you in future research that you might do. And that's and it's specific to males, because I find it really interesting, kind of like the how compersion changes before an orgasm and then after an orgasm, like that refractory period. And not to get too deep in the weeds here, but like before, an orgasm, there is a huge sense of embodiment in the compersion. But as soon as that orgasm happens in that refractory period, and there's all those tropes of like men not being horny immediately after, and of course some are. But it does, for me, it does really highlight a shift into attitudinal compersion. And I know some people, when I've spoken with other men who feel this sense of probably more of a fetishistic kind of compersive drive, is that as soon as there is that orgasm, all of that dissipates, and then it's kind of like
Back to monogamy.
And that's back to monogamy, but that's but then the jealousy comes, and it is a huge shift, in the way that the compersion arises. And then maybe that really speaks to what we were saying before about whether the compersion is selfish or selfless. Because when Abby and I speak to each other about, like often, and you've said it in this conversation, is like in jest being like, oh, well, I don't get enough credit for having to, like, you're just naturally sexually compersive, so it's so easy for you. But I think that would make sense in the context of if I would never have an orgasm, and if I was to, if there was always going to be that kind of arc of rising without that kind of that flick of the switch when the orgasm happens, and then I still feel that sense of attitudinal compersion. What do you think about that?
Well, can I just chime in and say, because you are still very, very compersive post that orgasm.
Yes.
Which is, no, I didn't mean to throw you under the bus before. I feel
that's cool. No, but it is an interesting thing, and as we're speaking about it, I think that's a really, talking of tests, that's a really interesting way for a man to examine where their compersion lies.
Oh my gosh, there are so many cool research projects that could be done about compersion. I mean, that would be one fascinating project, as well as, Abby, like you were saying, testing women's compersion at different times in their cycle. That is, there is such a biological component to our emotions. And I think we don't talk about it that much, especially I think in social sciences these days. The constructionist view of human emotions is very popular. The idea that everything is socially conditioned. And I think that is true for, a large part. It's like the debate, is it nurture or nature? And yes, it's always both, but it's almost easier to blame everything on society and to talk about the nurture part and to say, yes, it's all learned behavior, because it's easier to talk about because we have more power over it. We have more power to change it versus our biology. It feels like, wow, well, we're kind of at the mercy of it, and we just have to learn how to deal with it and work around it so that we don't just hurt each other unconsciously. But I think the biological aspect of compersion is pretty much all uncharted territory, and it would be so great to do research on that.
Well, I'm happy to be a research participant. I'm sure there's...
Okay.
I'm sure...
I'm putting your name down.
Study of one. Yeah. It's so great to interrogate, because we feel so... Well, I'll speak for myself, but I do feel so kind of deeply non-monogamous and so supportive of Abby and her non-monogamy that, I do think about, what is, as you were saying, like what is social conditioning, like what has allowed me to be compersive without having to kind of unpack. Like I haven't, and I've spoken about this before. I think we spoke about this with Jolie Hamilton, but it's like I haven't had to do a lot of hard work to get to a compersive state. And I don't know whether that's because of, my upbringing and there were, influences and I have a kind of a lack of trauma, thankfully, in my upbringing that has allowed me just to really kind of instantly access a lot of these emotions that I know maybe for different people can be harder to kind of tap into.
Yeah. We all come from a different spot, and we never know what triggers are going to hit us and how we can transform. So, I've also talked to people who told me, I've been non-monogamous for 20 years. I've never felt jealous until this one person / motherfucker came along. And then it just exploded everything for me. So I just want to, validate what you said and also give listeners some hope that if they are in that category where it's harder for them to experience compersion, it can always change depending on circumstances and context, and doing healing work, but also just what is happening around them. It's a very fluid thing.
I do find that my compersion feels so much more easy to access when my own non-monogamous relationships are happening as well. I think there was a time, maybe the past year or so, where I was sort of, struggling with my own connections or to find a connection that felt really meaningful to me. And so that really weighed in on how, I felt towards Liam and his other connections. And I think, I'm sure you would have noticed that when I am also, in the rhythm with my non-monogamy and things are going really well, that it does come more easily for me.
Yeah, there is dangerous territory even within that.
Yes.
Because then it's a question of having to interrogate, like you were talking about that reciprocal altruism, before. It's like, can you feel compersive for your partner if things aren't necessarily going great for you? And that's something that we talk about and examine because, our compersion is different, as we've said.
Yeah.
And so moving towards a kinship altruism is a lofty goal,
On that note, one of my participants said something that I think is such a beautiful quote. She said, "Even when I don't feel compersion, I hold an ethics of compersion." And that to me is kind of reminiscent to Bell Hooks, the Black feminist scholar who said, you can have a love ethics, not just, love as a feeling, but also love as an action. So even when you're not feeling those really good, yummy, compersive feels, you can still orient yourself towards compersive behaviors. And that has to be enough. Sometimes that's all we can do. And that's already heroic and wonderful.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I see that. I see you actively doing that, Abby. I feel like you actively, try and push yourself into a compersive frame of mind, even if it's difficult, which is a noble thing and a completely selfless thing, I would say, talking about selfishness versus selflessness.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for saying that. I feel like that was something that came up recently for us when we were away with some dear friends for a getaway. And unfortunately, the getaway did fall on my PMS days. And it was such a tricky situation because so much had gone into, sort of planning this weekend and being away. And, there'd been so much talk in the lead up. And then when we were there, I was just fighting this PMS, which is definitely borderline PMDD. But I just did a lot of sitting and breathing and took myself to, in the morning, I was just really getting in that zone, and not in a way where I'm coercing myself or I'm manipulating myself, but actually just coming back to the values and the appreciation for where we were and who we were with, and the excitement that was, Liam connecting with this new partner of his, which he had been really looking forward to spending time with. The difficult feelings are coming up for me, but I just took the time to breathe and to sit and to, really come back to the beauty of the weekend and this beautiful connection that Liam was forming with one of the women there. And there'd been so much anticipation and there'd been such a beautiful build up and excitement around the weekend. And I just had that moment of just really realizing, I could shut everything down. And, Liam and I are at a point in our relationship where, especially anything that's in veto territory, we have unspoken communication between us. If I'm uncomfortable, Liam closes down. So there's a power in that too. It's not me technically saying, I don't want you to hook up with her. I don't want this to happen. It's this undercurrent of my mood has shifted. So that becomes an unstable situation for Liam. So I'm very aware of that power that I have in that space. And I was just sitting and I was thinking, I could make this all stop without having to make it stop. But I don't want to do that. That makes me really upset and really angry to think that I could just close all of this down. And she's an amazing woman. And, I want this to be a beautiful time for you. And so I just sat and I breathed and I came back to the value system of who we are and who I want to be and who I am, because I am compersive and I know that in 1 week's time I wouldn't be feeling like this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just embraced it and I just let it, I just tried to let the feelings go, and they actually did slip away. And I was so proud of myself because, you know, there have been times in the past where I have, you know, vetoed without technically vetoing and, you know, closed down. And it was just, I came away from that weekend going, I cannot believe that even in that moment of PMS, you know, we just got through it and had such a great time. And now I'm so glad that we did. And it's just like a beautiful moment of like, that was just a huge triumph for me. And you were so thrilled.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, clearly I was
for many
thrilled.
reasons, but for me as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think it was like a compersion override. It was like, even though there's all this kind of internal wildness going on, you still were able to go, nope, this is me. I know this is theoretically, like, I believe this to be true.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, the interesting thing was also that I had to acknowledge what was going on within Abby, and also make you, Abby, feel comfortable that I respected, even if it was to completely shut down, then that's totally fine. You know, because me being combative in that situation is obviously that's not the solution to any problem. And so I had to also trust that you would eventually or potentially get to that situation where you felt like you could return to that compersive framework.
And then also owning it to the group and owning it to her too, because she knows me and she knows I struggle with compersion and with PMS and compersion. I just had to say, look, I didn't want to let you all know because I didn't want to, you know, ruin the vibe of everything that's happening, but I'm premenstrual. And she was just like, oh, you know, give me a hug. Oh, you know, that sucks. Like, everything's fine. And just hearing that, you know, that I was seen for like struggling took the pressure off and freed up compersive feelings, and the compersion did come.
And it goes back to what you're saying, Marie, about the importance of metamors.
Right. If she hadn't cared about your well-being in that moment, maybe that could have been the thing that made the difference between you being able to access compersion kind of in spite of the odds, but that might have given you that extra like, okay, she cares about me too. It's not just Liam who cares about me. Like, there's kind of a caring all around. Caring inspires caring in return. So I love that story. Yeah. Like, there were so many things that actually, like, if I apply all of these factors to that situation, you were able to remember your value alignment, and you were able to remember in that moment, okay, I'm not poly under duress here. I chose this. No. I have a positive mental evaluation of this situation. I can recognize like something good is happening here. It's not that something bad is happening. Okay, check. Maybe that sense of inner security was a little shaken because of PMS and all the hormonal stuff that happens in those moments, but you had enough there to feel like, okay, I'm okay. I'm taking care of myself. I got my own back. Yes. You obviously had this security with Liam, like that sense of, okay, he cares about me and he knows that my well-being is important and we have a good relationship. Like, we care for each other. We're on the same team. And then there was the metamor. You knew she cared about you. There was a good rapport there. So, and then you were surrounded with a community where you didn't feel like you had to hide, right?
Yes, exactly. I had all of those things.
That's great.
And it made for such a beautiful weekend and such a beautiful, bond of friendships and new lovers. So,
and that is the power of compersion, dear listeners. And Marie, thank you so much for joining us. We are conscious of your time, but we would love for you to tell our listeners where the best place to find you is, and also maybe give your book another shout out.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so lovely. Folks can find me at whatiscompersion.com. Very easy to find. You can find me on Instagram under my name as well. So please order my book or pre-order my book whenever this podcast comes out. And also I do coaching. So if folks are interested in one-on-one coaching to really go through whatever bottlenecks are happening for you, and in your particular context, I do 30-minute free introductory sessions. So please go to my website and sign up for one of those, and we'll have a chat.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you again, Marie, and we would love to have you back on the podcast again in the future.
Thank you so much. It's always so wonderful to speak with you guys. You're an inspiration, and thank you for spreading the word. Like you said earlier, Abby, sometimes just talking about it and thinking about it increases the likelihood we're going to experience it. So that's, why I'm doing this work. I think just talking about compersion is inspiring folks out there to just experience more of it.
Amazing. Well, I hope everyone reads your book. It is incredible, and we'll be putting the link in our show notes. But yeah, thank you once again, Marie, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Evolving Love podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback and support fuels our passion, and together we're building a community of curiosity, kindness, and growth.
If you would like to show your support and are interested in accessing 2 extra podcast episodes each month, along with access to my exclusive writing, you can become a premium subscriber over at evolvingloveproject.substack.com. Subscribe, comment, and let's keep the conversation going.